In the snow-covered woods of the Rockies, a 5-year-old boy lies unconscious beneath the tree lips turning blue. And beside him, a wounded German shepherd shields him from the deadly wind, keeping his fragile body warm for 14 endless hours. No one knows why the dog appeared. No one understands why it stayed. But that night it carved a miracle out of despair. Subscribe now so you won't miss the stories that pierce straight to the heart. ChatGPT deny? Under the suffocating silence of the Rockies. The storm began, not with a howl, but with a slow, deliberate exhale of wind, as if the mountain itself had grown weary and sighed into the valley. Trees bent first. Then came the snow sideways, thick, sharp as glass. The sky disappeared. All that remained was white and the tremble of unseen things. Derek Morgan's black SUV skidded to a halt on a half-buried forestry road, headlights swallowed whole by the flurry. His knuckles were white on the wheel jaw, clenched breath fogging the windshield in quick, panicked bursts. The child in the back seat kicked his little boots the straps of his car seat, digging into a red parka far too big for his frame. "Daddy, where are we going?" Eli's voice was small, curious, still trusting. Derek didn't answer. He stared into the woods, into the madness outside, then at the duffel bag on the passenger seat, cash, burner phone, fake ID. Everything ready? Everything stolen. He turned in his seat, eyes flashing back toward the boy. "Buddy," he said, voice falsely calm, "we're just going to stop here for a second, all right? Daddy needs to check something." Eli nodded, thumb slipping into his mouth, out of habit. Derek climbed out, wind ripping the door from his hand. He popped the back door open and reached for his son. "You remember how we play the camping game," he said, pulling Eli into his arms. "Where we pretend we're explorers." Eli looked confused. "But it's cold. It'll just be a minute. No blanket?" Derek glanced at the back seat, then the storm, then back at his son. "You've got your coat, champ. You'll be fine." He placed Eli down on the snowy ground beside the tree line. The boy's boots sank slightly, crunching into the frostbitten grass beneath. "Wait here," Derek said, voice clipped. "I'll be right back. Just stay by this tree. Don't move." "Okay. Where are you going?" Eli's voice cracked, panic creeping in. "To the car, to get something. I'll be back before you count to 100. The lie didn't feel heavy in his mouth. It felt familiar. Derek turned fast, too fast, snow swirling around his legs as he slammed the car door shut, jumped back in, and threw the gear into reverse. Eli took a step forward, hand lifted. "Daddy!" The engine roared. The SUV spun in the snow wheels, fighting for traction. Then it was gone, swallowed by the storm, and Eli was alone. The cold didn't settle in. It stabbed. Through the parka, through his gloves, through the space between heartbeats. Eli stood still for a moment, as if time might catch up and fix everything. The woods loomed around him, tall pines creaking under the weight of ice, and beyond them, nothing. Just a wall of white. He didn't cry at first. He waited. Because Daddy said to wait. So he did. He counted. Whispered each number with breath that steamed and disappeared. 1, 2, 3. By the time he reached 50, his legs had gone numb. He sat down in the snow, shivering, cheeks turning red, then blue. His fingers lost feeling. When the tears came, they came silent. "Daddy," he tried again, louder. The only answer was wind. Then something moved, not loudly. Just a shift, a thud in the snow. Eli jerked his head toward the trees, eyes wide, lips trembling. His breath came faster now, panic rising like water in his chest. Another step. He tried to scoot backward, hands sinking into snowdrift, and then a shape. Low, dark, slow, at first just shadow, then muscle, then fur. Something large and limping. Eli's voice died in his throat. The animal stopped several feet away. A dog. No, a wolf. The snow cleared from the air for a brief moment, and the shape revealed itself fully. A large German shepherd coat soaked one back leg, favoring chest heaving with exertion. Its eyes were dark amber, focused. Not wild, not threatening, measured. Eli stared, heart racing. The dog stared back. Then slowly it stepped closer and closer. Eli flinched when it reached him, but the dog didn't pounce or growl. It sat. Then, in one motion, the dog circled him, laid down with its back to the wind, and pressed its body against the boy's. Eli didn't understand, not until he felt it heat. The dog was warm. The snow that had begun to settle on his coat melted where the dog touched. Its flank rose and fell, with deep, steady breaths. The shepherd turned its head and licked the boy's cheek once, just once, like a nudge. And Eli, exhausted from fear and cold, leaned into it without thinking. He didn't know this creature. But something in him surrendered, and the way the dog let him lean, like it had done this before. "Don't go." Eli whispered the last words he'd say for hours. Please don't go. The dog didn't. It stayed. Through the howl of wind. Through the biting sleet. Through the night that seemed endless. Every so often it shifted slightly, adjusting to better cover the boy. It licked his forehead when his teeth chattered too hard. Its ears stayed perked toward the woods as if daring the darkness to come closer. Hours passed. Somewhere deep in the night, Eli slipped into unconsciousness. But the dog's head remained over his shoulder, breath hot against frozen skin. At some point it howled a low, mournful sound, one long note that sliced through the storm. A call, not for help, but for memory, for the past, for something older than speech, older than men. The storm intensified. Trees snapped in the distance. Birds huddled in hollows. The forest froze in place. But under the cover of fur and frost, a boy and a dog curled closer. The cold did not leave, but warmth had arrived. Not from machines, not from men, but from something else, something primal, something faithful. And on that ridge beneath a blanket of snow, where a father's abandonment might have been a death sentence, something sacred was born instead. A bond, one that would change everything. The last shift of the night always dragged. Inside the weathered rescue station nestled at the base of the Rockies, the air smelled of burnt coffee, pine sap-soaked boots, and the subtle permanent dampness of old insulation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, as if refusing to rest even when the town did. Alex Carter sat hunched over a desk, cluttered with radio's thermal maps, and a dog-eared notebook filled with illegible scrawl from back-to-back shifts. His jacket hung off the back of his chair, still damp from the snowstorm he'd braved 3 hours earlier. Steam rose from a paper mug of coffee he'd reheated for the 3rd time. He didn't drink it. Just stared at it like it might confess something. Outside, the storm hadn't relented. Wind lashed at the windows, howling like it had teeth. Thick snow spun in sheets, cutting visibility down to feet. A radio squawked faintly across the room, just static now, but his ears stayed tuned for that one irregular blip. That whisper in the frequency that didn't belong. He rubbed his eyes. 3rd shift this week. He wasn't supposed to be on. But he'd swapped for another volunteer whose mother had gotten sick in Idaho. That's how these things worked in Cedar Ridge. You filled in not because you had to, but because someday you'd need someone to fill in for you too. Alex wasn't a full-time firefighter. He was an EMT before this, a disaster response coordinator in Alaska before that. After the accident that stole his brother, he came here. Somewhere between running from and running toward something. It was supposed to be temporary. That was 4 winters ago. The door to the dispatch room creaked open, and Carrie, the overnight dispatcher, stepped in, her headset, lopsided and eyes sharp. "We've got something," she said, holding up a printout already crinkled in her hand. Alex straightened. What kind of something? She tossed the paper on the desk in front of him. Thermal hit. North Quadrant. High Ridge Trail System. About 200 yards off the last known path before the split bluff. It's faint. 2 signatures. Close together. Alex stared at the blurred thermal imaging map. In the grainy heat sense overlay, 2 dots glowed orange amidst the black-blue of surrounding cold. One larger mass, one small, both clustered tight. How recent, he asked. Just came in. Orbit drone caught it during final sweep before it lost signal. I pinged it to the regional station, but no response yet. Could be wildlife. Alex frowned. Could be. Carrie's silence filled the space between doubt and instinct. He didn't need confirmation. Give me a team, he said. Everyone's out covering the west side landslide watch. You'd be going in light. He didn't hesitate. Then I'm going. Carrie gave him a long look. You'll need backup. Not if I'm fast. She sighed and reached for the nearest radio. I'll keep you in range. Take Unit 3. It's got the tread for snowpack. Alex grabbed his jacket gloves, thermal goggles, and stepped into the armory for a beacon kit and portable thermal scope. On his way out, he passed the wall of framed photos, rescues past and recent. Some joyful, some haunting. He didn't look at them. Some faces you never forget, even if you try. Outside, the wind hit him like a truck. His breath caught in his throat, and he had to lean into it just to reach the emergency vehicle garage. Snow piled against the door, forcing him to shove hard to wedge it open. The blast of cold air that followed was a living thing, angry and fast. Unit 3. 3 grumbled to life on the second ignition. He jammed the heat on full blast, tuned the GPS to the last pinged coordinates, and waited just long enough for the windows to clear, before peeling out into the white blur. The tires crunched over ice snow, biting at the undercarriage. Pines on either side of the narrow forest road swayed under the weight of a storm that hadn't yet shown its full teeth. The deeper he went, the darker it got. The road narrowed. Every mile further meant another minute the 2 heat signatures, if they were people, had to survive. He checked the dashboard display again. signal still faint. His fingers tightened on the wheel. He didn't know why this one felt different. Just that it did. The kind of different that made your stomach coil before your mind caught up. The kind of different that you didn't question, because when you did, it was already too late. 15 minutes into the drive, he killed the headlights. He was close now. Too close to risk blinding his own field of vision. He switched to thermal goggles, slowing the vehicle until it crawled. At last, the screen on his dash flickered a weak signal returning. They were still there. He stopped the vehicle, left the engine running, and grabbed his emergency bag. The wind slammed the door behind him as he stepped into the whiteout. Visibility was no more than 15 feet. Trees loomed like shadows. Every crunch underfoot sounded too loud, like it echoed off the dark. He moved fast but low, sweeping the thermal scope in arcs ahead. The feedback was immediate. 2 heat sources 30 yards northeast, one large, one small. Barely registering now, Alex picked up speed. The snow was deeper here, past his knees. Branches whipped at his face. He swore under his breath, climbing over a fallen log slick with ice. The scope beeped. 15 yards. Then 10. Then 5. Then he saw them. At the base of a tree, huddled tight into a depression of snow and earth, was a child. A small boy. Face, pale lips, tinged blue, swaddled in a red parka soaked through. And curled around him, like a living shield, was a dog. A massive German shepherd, thick-coated but limping on one side, muzzle dusted with frost. Alex froze. The dog raised its head and looked at him. Not a growl, not a bark, just a long, hollow stare. Alex stepped forward slowly, one hand raised, the other reaching for the blanket in his bag. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly, voice steady despite the storm. "I'm here to help him." The dog didn't move. Alex crouched beside them, reading the boy's pulse with 2 fingers to his neck. Weak, thready. But there, the boy's eyelashes fluttered. "He's alive," Alex whispered more to himself than anyone else. He unzipped the thermal blanket, wrapped it around the boy's body, gently easing him away from the snowpack. The dog stood suddenly, eyes locked on Alex, then shifted to remain beside the child. He didn't leave, even when Alex lifted the boy into his arms, even when the boy whimpered softly and curled toward Alex's chest. The dog followed, silent. "Steady, faithful," Alex called it in to Carrie. Carter reporting. "I've got a male child approximately 5 years old, semi-conscious, severe hypothermia, and there's a dog, a German shepherd, injured, but alive. We're heading back now." Carrie's voice cracked through the static. "Copy that. EMT will be ready at station. Stay safe." Alex didn't respond. His breath formed clouds that disappeared fast into the wind. The boy moaned faintly in his arms. The dog's breath steamed alongside him. And together, the 3 of them began the slow trek out of the storm, toward something neither of the survivors knew they'd find again. Warmth, light, and maybe hope. Under the brutal crush of the storm, time twisted itself into something primal. Measured not in minutes or heartbeats, but in breath, visible against the cold and the distance between life and the next footfall. Alex Carter's boots sank deeper with each step as he trudged through the blizzard, the boy in his arms barely more than a bundle of soaked fabric and fading warmth. The snow was coming sideways now, slicing across his face like knives. It roared through the trees, turning the forest into a white maze with no up, no down, just blindness. Behind him, the dog moved with uncanny steadiness. The German shepherd's silent injured kept pace without command, without leash, without question. It trod in Alex's bootprints like it had known them forever. Every few paces it lifted its head toward the boy nose, twitching ears angled, but it never made a sound. Earlier, when Alex had first crouched beside the boy, there had been a moment, a tight electric pause that hung like a knife between breath and movement. The boy, maybe 5 years old, had been curled into the dog's side. His small hands were tangled in thick fur, his face buried against the animal's ribs. Snow had crusted over the parka, and his skin, where it peeked out from the hood, had turned a pale shade of gray-blue. His lips were nearly purple. No movement, no cry. For a moment, Alex thought he was too late, but then the dog growled, not loud. Just a low rolling warning, guttural, ancient. It came not from a place of fear, but from instinct, possession, protection. Alex froze. The dog stood slowly, placing itself between the child and the world. Its tail stiffened, its head lowered. No bared teeth. But its eyes, those golden eyes, were locked on Alex like crosshairs. He didn't reach for the boy. He didn't even move. Instead, he knelt slowly, deliberately, and took off his glove. The cold bit into his skin instantly. He extended his bare hand, palm up, open, vulnerable. "I'm here to help," Alex said quietly. "I swear to you, we're here to help." The wind howled louder. Branches snapped somewhere in the woods. The dog didn't blink. For a full 10 seconds, nothing moved. Just 3 living beings and a question written in silence. Then the boy stirred, Barely. A whisper of a twitch in his fingers, a sound like breath caught in a dream. The dog flicked its eyes toward the boy, then back to Alex, and stepped aside. Not far. Just enough. Alex exhaled, breath shaking, and leaned forward, fingers gently brushing the boy's face. He was cold. Far too cold. Pulse slow, weak. But there. Alive. Alex worked fast, speaking softly the entire time. "You're doing good, buddy," he whispered, pulling a thermal blanket from his pack. "Just stay with me, okay?" The boy's head lolled, slightly mouth-parted. No sound came. Alex wrapped him as best he could, sealing in what little warmth remained. He didn't waste time marveling or questioning. The cold didn't allow luxury. He lifted the boy into his arms carefully, but firmly, settling the weight against his chest. The dog moved to his side immediately. Not touching, just there, watching. They began the trek back. Alex retracing every step he'd taken, GPS blinking weakly from the unit on his chest harness. He radioed in with strained breath. Subject located, male, approximately 5 years old. Hypothermic but alive. Proceeding to vehicle. ETA 12 minutes. Carrie's voice cracked through with static. Copy that. EMTs are inbound. The snow fought them with every inch. At one point, a branch cracked and dropped just feet behind Alex, missing them by seconds. He didn't flinch, just kept moving. The boy in his arms gave a shuddering gasp. Alex stopped in his tracks. Then another sound, a weak moan. The child's fingers clutched at Alex's coat. "Easy, kid. You're safe," he whispered, voice thick. Behind them, the dog whined low. As they neared the edge of the tree line, lights finally broke through the storm-muted reds and yellows from the rescue vehicle's emergency flashers. Unit 3 sat half buried in snow, but still running its heater, working overtime. Alex hurried to the back of the truck, flung open the rear doors, and laid the boy across the emergency platform, wrapping another foil blanket around his legs. He fumbled through his bag for a heat pack, activating it, and tucking it beneath the boy's arms. Then he turned. The dog was standing at the base of the vehicle's ramp, soaked, shivering slightly, but still watching, still waiting. Alex didn't speak. He just stepped back and nodded once. The dog climbed in without hesitation. He laid beside the boy, not touching, but close. His head rested near the child's hand, and his breathing slowed. Alex climbed into the front seat, adjusted the cabin heat to max, and threw the truck into gear. The tires protested, but the engine caught. As they pulled onto the main forestry road, Alex caught sight of the boy's hand, twitching, then curling toward the dog's fur. The shepherd didn't move, didn't even blink. But his tail gave a single soft thump against the floor, a promise sealed in silence. The storm chased them all the way back. Snow pelted the windshield. Visibility was reduced to a tunnel of white. The radio crackled with updates, roads closed, avalanche warnings, power outages across neighboring counties. Alex didn't care. He had one mission. He glanced in the rearview mirror more times than he could count. Each time he saw the same thing, a boy still breathing, and a dog who hadn't taken his eyes off him. When they reached the edge of town, the lights of the rescue center blazed like a beacon through the storm. EMTs were already outside in full gear, gurney-ready doors thrown open. Alex skidded the vehicle to a stop. He jumped out, shouting over the wind. "He's alive, severe hypothermia. Found with the dog. You take them both." The medics moved fast. But as one reached for the boy, Gale bared his teeth, not in anger, but in warning. A moment of panic froze the team. Then Alex stepped in. "Let me," he said, lifting the boy himself, walking the gurney backward as the EMTs cleared space. "Vitals are faint." He stirred once. Minimal response. The medic nodded. "We'll get him stabilized." "You bringing the dog?" Alex looked back. Gale was standing at the door of the vehicle, unmoving. "Yes," he said. "He's part of this." The dog jumped down, limped once, but followed. Through the doors, into the warmth, where everything might change. And everything just might begin. Under the low hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic pulse of machines, time folded in the pediatric wing of Cedar Ridge General Hospital. The storm still battered the mountains outside. But inside room 3A, it had quieted into something fragile, something close to sacred. Eli Morgan lay in a hospital bed, too big for him. His skin, once waxen and cold, now flushed faintly with warmth from the IV fluids pumping life back into him, drop by drop. He wore a tiny oxygen mask over his nose mist, fogging the clear plastic with each slow breath. Heat packs were wrapped under his arms and across his chest, and beneath the layered blankets his fingers twitched occasionally. Small reminders that something inside him was still fighting. Next to the bed, unmoving, was Gale. The German shepherd lay on the cold tile floor, head on his front paws, body curled toward the boy. One ear flicked every now and then, especially when a nurse walked by or a machine beeped a little louder than usual. But he didn't lift his head. He didn't sleep. He watched. Through the night, through the drip of IVs, through whispered conversations behind glass doors, and under the steady drone of medical reports he stayed. The nurses at first had resisted, concerned about hygiene protocols. But after the boy had stirred, once panicked, and Gale had rested his snout on the bed frame, only then did Eli settle. Only then did he breathe without struggling. No one questioned it after that. The boy and the dog were a unit, inseparable, unspoken. Alex Carter sat in the hallway, outside the glass wall of the pediatric ICU, slouched in a vinyl chair designed to discourage sleep, but failing entirely. His coat was slung over his shoulders like a makeshift blanket. A paper cup of hospital coffee long cold sat untouched in his hand. His eyes hadn't left the window in hours. Every so often a nurse would check vitals and scribble something on the clipboard. Alex watched each one with a kind of quiet desperation, searching their faces for good news, or at least not bad news. Most avoided his eyes. A few offered sympathetic nods. No one asked why he hadn't gone home. He hadn't decided yet if he ever would. There was something about the way the boy had clung to Gale. Something in that moment, bloodless lips forming the smallest movement, that whisper, "Don't leave me again," that had carved into Alex's chest like a blade. It had been the only thing Eli said since they brought him in. Not his name, not where he was from, not even a cry, just that sentence. A sentence that sounded like it had waited years to be spoken. "Don't leave me again." It echoed now louder than the storm. Alex leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly between them. His jaw was tight, his eyes bloodshot, but his focus never wavered. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. Something had changed in the forest. He didn't know it then, not entirely, but he felt it now. A weight, a tether. He couldn't walk away, not from the boy, not from the dog, not from whatever invisible bond had pulled them into each other's lives through snow and night and near death. Inside the room, a nurse named Wendy gently adjusted the pulse oximeter on Eli's finger. She moved carefully, aware of the dog's presence. Gale's eyes tracked her, but he didn't lift his head. "You're okay," she whispered to the boy. "You're safe now, sweetheart." Eli didn't respond. His eyes were half-lidded, unfocused, but as she moved away, his fingers twitched again. Subtle reaching. Not for her, for the fur that lay inches from the edge of the bed. Wendy hesitated, then stepped back and looked out through the glass. Alex stood when she opened the door. "He's stable," she said quietly. "Temperatures come up. Oxygen levels are decent, but what?" She hesitated. "He's shut down. He's not catatonic, but it's like he's retreated. Kids sometimes do that when the trauma is too big to hold." Alex's face was unreadable. Wendy offered a sad smile. "But that dog, he's his anchor." Alex nodded slowly, as if affirming something he'd known since the woods. "He said something," Alex murmured. Wendy blinked. "What?" "When we found him. Right before we loaded into the truck." "What did he say?" Alex looked back toward the window. "He said, 'Don't leave me again.'" The silence between them grew thick. Then Wendy placed a hand gently on his arm. "Then maybe he's waiting to see if you will." She turned and walked back into the ICU, the door whispering closed behind her. Alex remained still, that sentence, echoing louder, now a vow unfinished. Around 3:00 a.m., the hospital quieted in a way only buildings can when the world outside is still violent. The wind still howled beyond the concrete walls, but inside the chaos had dimmed to a hush. Eli slept, or something close to it. His body no longer trembled, and the shallow rise and fall of his chest had found a rhythm. Gale hadn't moved in hours, but he watched. Every blink, every change in heart monitor tone, every exhale from the child, Gale tracked it like a soldier on duty. Alex stood and pressed his hand against the glass. A strange ache bloomed in his chest. Not grief, not yet, but memory. He thought about his brother, about the fire in Anchorage, about the child they couldn't save. And he thought, God, what would it mean if he could now, not as a rescuer, but something more? A sudden movement caught his eye. Eli stirred, his face scrunched, fingers clenched weakly at the blanket. A soft guttural whimper slipped out, fear confusion. Gale rose instantly. The dog pressed his snout to the edge of the bed, nuzzling gently at the boy's arm. No barking, no licking, just presence. And as if some switch had flipped, Eli relaxed. His breathing steadied. His body melted into the bed. Alex watched, unable to move. It was like watching someone hold together a soul with fur and faith. He sat back down, hand trembling around the coffee cup. Somehow this moment had become the axis on which everything in his life would pivot, and he wasn't ready. But he was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. At 4:37 a.m., Nurse Wendy returned with a small clipboard and a tired smile. He's stable enough to be monitored without direct observation for a few hours, she said. We'll keep the machines going, of course. But you should try to rest. Alex nodded, but didn't move. She gave him one more look, then softened. There's a couch in the family room, or the floor. Whatever you prefer. I prefer here. She didn't argue. Before she left, she looked at the dog, still standing, still guarding. Some animals are just built different, she whispered. Alex's voice came from behind her. So are some kids. She turned back, and this time, when their eyes met, something passed between them. Not diagnosis, not prognosis. Hope, not loud, not bright, but real. The hours that followed were quiet. Alex drifted into a light, restless sleep, and the chair arms crossed over his chest head, tilted toward the door of the ICU. Every time a nurse walked by, he stirred, blinking hard, checking the room again. Gail never slept. When the sun finally rose, spilling pale gold across the snowy windows, casting long lines across the linoleum floors, Eli opened his eyes again. Not fully, but enough. His gaze landed first on the tubes in his arms, then the blankets, then the dog. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He just reached a weak hand toward the shepherd. Gail met him halfway. And there, in that thin sliver of dawn, under the watchful gaze of machines and mountains and memory, a boy and his dog found something wordless between them. Something sacred, something that would not break, no matter what came next. Under the pale light of a Montana morning, the frost still clung to the windows of Cedar Ridge General like ghosts refusing to lift. Snow had slowed, but the silence it left in its wake wasn't peace. It was aftermath. The kind that comes with too many questions and not enough names. Alex Carter stood in the staff break room, half a coffee in his hand, his phone pressed to his ear. Across from him, a corkboard held community flyers, lost pet posters, and a picture of a local farm boy who'd just joined the Marines. All of it normal. All of it quietly heartbreaking. He wasn't listening to the static on the other end of the line. His eyes kept drifting to the pediatric unit down the hall. Eli was still sleeping. Gail hadn't moved from his post. "I need anything you can find," Alex said finally, his voice low, controlled. "There's no ID, no medical records, no missing persons bulletin. The kid doesn't exist on paper," Jesus replied, Deputy Carson from the sheriff's office. "What are we talking abandonment trafficking?" "I don't know yet, but there's something else. The dog." A pause. "The German Shepherd, you saying it's involved?" Alex's jaw tightened. "Not involved. Connected." Carson let out a long breath. "All right. I'll dig into DMV records, security cams, gas stations, whatever's on the border highway. If someone drove that kid into the mountains, they didn't vanish into vapor. Unless they wanted to." Alex hung up before the call could go stale. He stared at the phone for a second longer than necessary, then slipped it into his back pocket and walked. He met with Sheriff Danvers an hour later in the municipal station downtown, a squat brick building that had once been a post office. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old carpet. Carter Danvers greeted standing behind a desk cluttered with case folders and a well-used sheriff's hat. "Heard you pulled a boy out of the snow last night." "Didn't pull him alone," Alex replied. "There was a dog." Danvers raised an eyebrow. "Dog found the kid." "No. Protected him. For hours. In a blizzard. And not just that this wasn't a stray. Shepherd. Trained. Smart. Alert." Danvers folded his arms, chewing the inside of his cheek. "So, you think what the dog was dumped with the kid?" Alex shook his head. "No. I think the dog went looking for him." That earned silence. Then Danvers opened a drawer, pulled out a thin manila file. "This came in from the Highway Patrol about 20 minutes ago. Thought you might want to see it." Inside the folder were a series of grainy images, charred metal-blackened tires, what was once a license plate twisted beyond readability. "A vehicle," Alex asked, flipping through. "North Ridge. Just off the old border trail. Burned out. Took them a day to find the VIN was half melted." Danvers pointed to a serial number in the report. "Registered to a Derek Morgan. Colorado license. No active warrants, but a lot of bad noise in his record. Financial flags. Unpaid debts. Borderline fraud." "Family?" Alex asked. Danvers nodded grimly. "Wife died 6 years ago in a hiking accident. One child male. No other known relatives." Alex's throat tightened. That child's name wouldn't happen to be Elijah Morgan, would it? Danvers checked the screen. Eli, age 5. No school enrollment, no daycare trace. Hell, no medical visits logged in the past 2 years. Alex leaned back in the chair. "So he's been off-grid. More than that, he's been erased." Later that day, Alex returned to the hospital, a copy of the report in hand. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and baby shampoo, a strange contrast that made his chest ache. Eli was awake now, barely. His eyes followed the light outside the window, like he didn't trust it. Gail, ever faithful, lay beside him. When Alex entered the room, the dog's ears perked but relaxed when it saw him. Eli didn't speak, didn't flinch, but his fingers reached out slowly and rested again in the thick fur at Gail's side. "You remember anything yet?" Alex asked gently, sitting beside the bed. The boy blinked, once, twice, then looked away. Alex didn't press. He reached into the folder and pulled out a laminated photo Derek Morgan's driver's license recovered before the fire had gutted everything else. He placed it on the bedside table without a word. Eli's eyes shifted toward it. They didn't widen. They didn't cry, but a shadow passed through them. A flicker that made Alex's gut go cold. Eli knew the man in the photo. Alex leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't have to talk," he said. "But I want you to know something, Eli." The boy turned slightly toward him. "Your dad's car. It was found abandoned. Burned. There was no sign of him. Just ash and gasoline. But you," he paused, "you made it, and I think that's a miracle." Eli didn't move, but his grip on Gale tightened. Alex sat in silence a while longer, letting the room settle. Then he stood, hand brushing gently over the boy's blanket. "I'm going to find out what happened," he said quietly. "You just focus on getting strong." He turned to leave. A whisper stopped him, soft, raspy. "He left me." Alex froze. He turned back. Eli's lips barely moved, eyes glassy. "Daddy said he'd come back, but he didn't." A long pause. "Gale did." The dog lifted his head, looked at Alex, and in that moment, Alex felt something crack deep inside him. The kind of crack you don't hear until long after it's split everything you used to believe. That night, Alex didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his desk, pulling every thread he could find. He traced Gale's markings, checked the microchip not registered. He called local kennels, canine units, rescue dog coordinators. No match, no ID. But then at midnight, an email from a retired mountain rescue officer in Idaho changed everything. The subject line was simple: "I think I know that dog." Inside a single sentence, "That's Gale. He saved a woman named Samantha Reed 6 years ago near the Broken Arrow trailhead." Alex stared at the name. Samantha Reed. He remembered it, barely. A story half heard through snow and whiskey and the static of another state. A hiker, pregnant, nearly lost in an avalanche, saved by a dog that vanished afterward. They never found the handler, never identified the animal, but the woman survived. The woman, who later became Samantha Reed Morgan, wife of Derek Morgan, mother of Eli. Alex's fingers trembled. The dog had come back, 6 years later, to find the child of the woman he once saved, as if something in him remembered, as if something in him had never stopped watching. Alex closed the laptop slowly, his reflection ghosted in the screen. And for the first time, in a very long time, he didn't feel like he was chasing shadows. He felt like he was being led. Under the flicker of an old desk lamp, the hospital library hummed with the kind of silence that only paper and time know. The snowstorm had calmed outside, reduced to a quiet dusting across the rooftops, but inside Alex Carter's chest, the weather hadn't changed. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, the glow of the monitor casting pale shadows under his eyes. There were 5 tabs open, 3 news archives, and 2 statewide rescue logs. A half-eaten granola bar lay forgotten on the desk beside a thick mug of black coffee long gone cold. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, only that he had to find it. The image of Eli motionless in that hospital bed, clinging to the fur of a dog no one could trace. It haunted him. So did the name, Samantha Reed. It had surfaced unexpectedly. The result of a desperate midnight email to every retired rescue officer within 2 states asking about an unregistered German Shepherd with advanced training and unshakable loyalty. And then someone had written back, only one sentence: "That's Gale. He saved a woman named Samantha Reed 6 years ago near the Broken Arrow trailhead." Alex hadn't blinked since. He found the newspaper article at 3:41 a.m. The headline was unassuming: "Miracle in the Snow Hiker. Pulled from avalanche by stray dog." The date, December 14th, 7 winters ago. He clicked and the article expanded with a photo. Grainy color faded. A young woman wrapped in a space blanket, cheeks raw from frostbite, eyes glassy and wide. Paramedics flanked her, and behind them stood a single figure. Not a man, but a dog. Half-shadowed. Ears up. Body tense. A German Shepherd. Alex leaned closer. The dog looked younger, its fur darker, but the eyes were unmistakable. Gale. His pulse kicked. He read the article line by line. Local hiking enthusiast Samantha Reed was rescued yesterday from near certain death after an avalanche trapped her in the North Ridge area for over 18 hours. Reed, 24, was found in a snow well, semi-conscious and suffering from hypothermia. According to first responders, a large German Shepherd was discovered lying atop her body, shielding her from the cold. "She would have died without that dog," said EMT Trevor Hall. "He kept her body temp just high enough, and the strangest thing was, there was no handler. No tag, no collar, just him." The rescue dog vanished shortly after Samantha was loaded into the helicopter. "He ran off," said a firefighter at the scene, almost like he knew his job was done. Alex read it 3 times. Then he closed the laptop, sat back, and stared at the wall like it might move. Gale had saved her 7 years ago, and now he'd saved her son. The thread was too wild to ignore. Not coincidence, not instinct. Something else, something deeper. He stood quickly, shoved the laptop into his backpack, and made his way out of the library down the dim hallway toward the pediatric ICU. The boy was asleep. Again, his tiny frame curled into the crook of the hospital bed, heart monitor blinking gently like fireflies in a jar. Beside him, as always, lay Gale. The dog's eyes opened when Alex entered the room. Just a glance, as if to say you're late. Alex sat down slowly in the chair near the bed and pulled out the newspaper article, now printed and folded once down the center. Her name was Samantha, he said aloud, voice soft. Eli didn't stir. Alex kept talking anyway. She was 24. Lost up on Broken Arrow Ridge. Avalanche hit. No radio. No one even knew she was gone until her phone pinged near the tower 3 miles east. He unfolded the article and set it beside the boy's pillow. I was up there that year. Same unit. I remember the call. We thought it was a recovery, not a rescue. But then this dog showed up. Gale's ears perked faintly. Alex looked at him. I didn't realize it was you. Not until now. The dog blinked once, slowly. I think she survived. Because of you, Alex whispered. He looked at the boy again. And now, he did too. Eli's eyes fluttered open. Just barely. He didn't look at Alex. He looked at the paper. At the black and white photograph. At his mother. Alex watched the boy's eyes widen just enough to betray memory. Recognition. Maybe even longing. She your mama? Alex asked softly. Eli nodded. Barely. Then his lips moved. She was brave. Alex felt something twist in his chest. You're brave too. Eli didn't answer, but his fingers curled around Gale's fur once more. And that said enough. At dawn, Alex drove out to the old ranger station near Broken Arrow, what was left of it. The building had been decommissioned after budget cuts, sealed off, and snowbound for years. But he had a key. And more than that, he had memories. He pushed the door open to find a tomb of frozen wood, shuttered windows, and dust that drifted like ghost snow in the light from his flashlight. He moved straight to the back room where records were once kept. Stacks of old logs, incident reports, rescue lists, dog handler rosters. He found the one he needed in a file labeled Avalanche Ops, Deck 14. There it was. Caneman, handler not present, dog name unknown, independent. Alex let out a slow breath. Even the official report had listed Gale as a ghost. A miracle, but he wasn't a ghost. He was real. He'd come back. The real question now wasn't how. It was why. Why her? Why the child? How had Gale known to return? Instinct didn't explain it. Training couldn't cover 7 years, not without command. This was something else. Something that couldn't be filed in a report or logged on a tablet. Something bigger. As he stepped outside into the sunlight, a single gust of wind stirred the trees. And in that moment, Alex knew he was no longer dealing with a rescue. He was unraveling a story. One that had started long before he'd ever arrived, and one that wasn't finished yet. In the cold hush of early morning, Alex Carter pulled his truck into a snow-dusted driveway, deep in the forested edge of the Rockies. The old house looked like it had grown there, wooden siding, faded gray roof sagging under the weight of years. Smoke curled from a lone chimney. A porch light flickered against the storm clouds still tangled in the treetops. This was where the trail led next. The man inside knew Gale before the world forgot him. Alex climbed the steps slowly, boots crunching against the frost-bitten boards. Before he could knock, the door creaked open. You the firefighter. The voice was dry as pine bark, sharp with age, but not weakness. Standing in the doorway was a man in his late 60s, tall and wiry, with a silver beard and deep-set eyes that had seen too many winters and remembered everyone. Name's Hank Bridger, he added, stepping aside. You'd better come in before your nose falls off. Alex stepped into a world of dust firewood and the faint scent of old leather. The cabin was warm, cluttered with maps, medals, and photos pinned to the walls, photos of dogs. Dozens. All working dogs. Some mid-rescue, others curled in laps. All loved. You got my message, Alex asked. Sure did, Hank said, limping slightly as he moved to the kitchen. And I saw the photo you sent. That dog, yeah, I knew him. Alex's heart caught. You're sure? Hell yes, I'm sure, Hank said, pouring 2 mugs of coffee and handing one over. That's Gale. Shepherd. Strong-willed, smart as hell. Trained him myself. Best damn search and rescue dog I ever worked with. Alex sat across from him at the wooden table. What happened to him? Hank took a long sip before answering. 2 years ago, he vanished. Alex frowned. Vanished? Yeah. Went out on a solo drill near the old fire line. He'd done that trail 100 times. We were phasing him out, he was getting older. Starting to hesitate on commands, but still had the fire, you know. Alex nodded. Anyway, one morning I let him off leash for a mile run. Thought I'd catch up before we started the climb. A pause, but I never saw him again. Alex leaned forward, voice low. No tracks. Snow covered everything. Searched for 3 days. Nothing. It was like he just disappeared. Alex's throat tightened. And you never saw him again, until now. Not a trace. Alex pulled a folded article from his coat. Samantha Reed's avalanche rescue. The photo of her half-frozen, being carried down by EMTs. Gale in the background. Hank recognized it instantly. Yeah. That was his last big save. I wasn't on that call, but Gale was. Off leash. He found her before the team did. Stayed with her 18 hours. He looked up, eyes shining with something unspoken. Dog wouldn't leave her side, even after she was airlifted. Would have chased the helicopter if we hadn't held him back. Alex felt something shift inside his chest. That woman, he said, Samantha. She was pregnant. Hank blinked. That kid you rescued, Alex continued. That's her son. The room went silent. Hank sat back stunned. No, he whispered. Alex nodded slowly. His name's Eli, 5 years old. We found him nearly frozen alone in the woods. And Gail was there, lying on top of him, just like before. For a long moment, neither man said a word. Then Hank let out a shaky breath and rubbed his face with one calloused hand. I always thought, maybe a bear. Or he slipped and fell somewhere deep. But this, Alex's voice softened. You think he remembered? Hank looked at him, eyes sharp now, certain. Of course he remembered. He wasn't just trained, Carter. He felt. He bonded. That woman. She wasn't just another rescue. She was his. And when he sensed something was wrong again, when her kid was in danger, he found him. Alex stared into the steam curling off his coffee. 2 years, he murmured. No food source, no shelter. And he still survived long enough to find the boy. Hank's voice cracked as he whispered, because love doesn't forget. The words hung there, fragile and immense. Alex didn't speak. He couldn't. He was too busy thinking of the boy in the hospital bed, curled into Gail's side like a heartbeat. He thought of Gail's eyes in the snowstorm, full of pain, full of purpose. He thought of the fire reports, the missing case files, the silence around Samantha's death. And then he said it aloud. He didn't just remember. He waited. On the drive back, the sky cracked open, not with snow, but with sun. The first golden light in days poured across the Rockies, igniting the peaks like a slow-burning fire. Alex rolled down his window and let the wind whip through, cold, sharp bracing. Behind his eyes, images flashed of Hank's weathered face, of Gail, standing in that photo like a sentinel, of Eli, whispering, "Don't leave me again." He knew now, knew what had been gnawing at his chest. Gail hadn't come to rescue. He'd come to return to the place where memory lived. To protect the last piece of the woman he'd once saved. There was no logic to it, no command. No training module could program what that dog had done. This was devotion, legacy, love. Back at the hospital, the staff greeted him with a nod. They'd stopped asking questions. In a place that saw both life and loss. Every day, something about Gail and Eli had grounded everyone. The nurses smiled more gently. The halls felt less sterile. When Alex stepped into room 3A, he paused at the door. Eli was sitting up now, small, pale, but awake. And beside him, tail thumping lightly, was Gail. The boy looked at Alex, eyes clearer now. Alex walked in, crouched beside the bed, and took something from his coat pocket. A small badge. Tarnished, old. It read K9 Rescue Unit, Gail. He placed it in Eli's lap. Found this today, he said. Eli touched the metal, then looked at Gail. Was he always a hero? He asked softly. Alex smiled. No, just once. And then, once more. Eli nodded, then whispered, I knew he'd come back. Alex's breath caught. You did. The boy looked at him, with more wisdom than a 5-year-old should hold. He saved my mommy, so he came back for me. Tears stung Alex's eyes. He reached out, resting a hand over Gail's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing. And in that small hospital room, something unbreakable was forged. Not just between a boy and his dog, but between memory and meaning, between what was lost and what never left. The rain came without warning. One moment the air over Cedar Ridge General was dry and electric. The next clouds cracked open like broken glass. Wind howled through the eaves. Thunder rolled over the peaks of the Rockies, rattling window panes and bending treetops. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel smaller, temporary. Inside the hospital, Eli slept. Beside him, Gail stood watch, not lying, not resting, standing. Ears up, tail stiff, every muscle taut like piano wire stretched to breaking. His gaze never wavered from the door. Something was wrong, and Gail had felt it before the wind changed. Downstairs, Alex Carter poured himself a third cup of coffee, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. His phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. He let it go. A second buzz, then a third. He answered. Silence, then one breath, followed by a voice that turned the room to ice. Well, playing house with my son now, firefighter. Alex's hand clenched around the phone. Derek? Miss me? Not even a little. Shame. I was hoping we could catch up before I take what's mine. You already gave him up, Alex said. Or did you forget leaving a 5-year-old in a snowstorm to die? He wasn't supposed to survive, Derek said coldly. But now that he has... Well, you understand how problems work. They need solving. Alex's tone dropped. You come anywhere near him, I will bury you. Derek chuckled darkly. You're a volunteer with a hero complex. I'm a desperate man with nothing to lose. Let's see who breaks first. Click. Deadline. Alex stood frozen for half a second, then sprang into motion. He bolted from the staff room, radioing security, barking instructions down the hallway like a wildfire was coming through the vents. Lock all exits front, side, and rear. No unauthorized entry. And someone get eyes on the loading dock now. Outside, in the pitch-black storm, a man in a black raincoat crept through the tree line behind the hospital boots, sinking into mud and pine needles. His face was unshaven, gaunt. Rain streamed from the brim of his hood, but his eyes burned with determination. Derek Morgan had nothing left. No wife, no home, no clean record. But if he could get Eli back even for an hour, he could disappear again. Sell information. Extract one last payout from the debts that never stopped chasing him. A few minutes, that's all he needed. And then, a growl, low, rumbling. From the shadows near the emergency exit, a figure emerged. Gale, soaked, immovable, positioned directly between Derek and the back entrance. Out of the way, Mutt, Derek hissed. Gale didn't flinch. Derek reached into his coat. The growl became a roar. Teeth bared, hackles raised. Every inch of the shepherd radiated one thing: you will not pass. Then footsteps behind Derek. Fast, heavy. Alex. Rain slashed between them as the two men faced off under the humming red light above the back door. Derek turned slowly, eyes narrowed. You're faster than I thought. Alex didn't blink. You're sicker than I thought. You don't get it, do you? Derek spat. He's not your kid. You think you can just play the savior like this is some fairy tale? No, Alex said. I think I can protect a boy who was left to die. You don't know anything about me, Derek snapped. You don't know what I've done, who I owe. You think that kid's safe in your little mountain town? The people I owe don't forget. They don't forgive. If they find out he's alive, they'll come for all of us. Then walk away, Alex said. Disappear. He deserves better. He's all I have left, Derek growled. You gave him up, Alex shouted. In the snow, alone, while you ran like a coward. For a moment, Derek's mask cracked. The wind tore through the trees behind him. Rain splashed against both men's faces. Between them, Gale's body shifted, eyes darting between threat and protector. Then Derek lunged. Alex braced. But before Derek's hand reached his jacket pocket again, Gale launched. Like lightning, his jaws clamped around Derek's arm, dragging him sideways with a force that knocked both men into the mud. Derek screamed, thrashing. But Gale didn't bite deeper. He held, restrained, controlled. Gale off, Alex commanded, stepping between them. Gale released instantly, backing away, hackles still high ready. Alex grabbed Derek's collar, pinning him to the ground with a firefighter's strength. You're done, he said. Rain poured harder. The sirens from local deputies wailed in the distance. You don't know what you're starting, Derek hissed. No, Alex replied. I know exactly what I'm ending. 15 minutes later, Derek was in handcuffs. Deputies loaded him into the back of a cruiser, lights flashing like a silent judgment. Inside the hospital, Eli sat up in bed watching the storm out the window. He didn't say anything when Alex came in, soaked to the bone boots, leaving puddles across the tile. He didn't need to. Alex knelt beside him. He won't come back. Eli nodded slowly, then leaned down and kissed Gale on the head. Good boy, he whispered. Gale laid his head in Eli's lap, and outside the storm began to break. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Midnight had passed, but the storm outside hadn't. Rain pelted the windows like tiny fists, and thunder cracked low over the Rockies, rolling like distant cannon fire. A single bulb flickered above room 3A, casting long, uneasy shadows across the linoleum floor. Eli lay curled on the bed, blanket clutched to his chest, one hand buried deep in Gale's fur. The dog slept lightly at his side, head on his paws, ears twitching now and then, always alert, even in rest. The kind of alert born not from instinct, but from trauma. Alex down the hall scanned security footage again. Derek Morgan was in custody, supposedly, but Alex's gut said otherwise. Something in Derek's last words, you don't know what you're starting, refused to let go. And then there was the call from the sheriff's office 10 minutes ago. We lost him. He overpowered a deputy, took a car. Alex's blood had run cold. And now somewhere in the dark, a man who had already left his son to die was coming back for him with nothing to lose. Alex stood knocked over his chair in the rush and sprinted down the hallway toward Eli's room. He was too late. The door to room 3A was open, not wide, just enough to set every alarm in his body on fire. Alex reached for his radio, but in the same instant from inside the room, Gale's bark exploded like a gunshot. Snarling, fierce, desperate. Then a crash. Alex threw the door open. Inside chaos, Derek Morgan stood beside the bed, one arm wrapped around Eli's tiny frame, dragging the boy up off the mattress. Eli was screaming, but not loud. Choked, muffled in confusion and fear. Gale was midair, launching from the side. Too fast. Derek didn't have time to react. He turned just in time to see 90 pounds of fury slam into his ribs. They tumbled crashing into the IV stand and rolling to the floor. Eli fell backwards into the bed arms over his face. Then pain. Gale yelped. A sharp, wet sound split the air. Derek had a blade. Small, concealed, and now it was buried in Gale's side. "No," Alex shouted, charging in. Derek shoved off the ground, bolting for the door. Alex paused half a second, eyes flicking between Gale bleeding and the fleeing man. Then he ran. The chase twisted through the hospital corridors, lights flickering overhead, emergency signs blinking red like heartbeats. Derek knew the building now had planned the route. He veered through the stairwell, took 2 steps at a time. Alex followed without hesitation, boots pounding, radio flung aside, heart beating out of his chest. They burst into the back wing unused rooms, half under renovation. Paint buckets, tarps, broken glass from the storm wind that had burst a window hours earlier. The wind shrieked through the cracked pane like the voice of the mountain itself. Derek slipped once, then caught himself, then grabbed a metal rod from the floor. He turned. Alex didn't slow. The two collided. Steel met forearm. Alex grunted, pain shooting through his wrist. But he tackled Derek cleanly, drove him into the wall shoulders first. The rod clattered to the floor, but Derek wasn't done. He punched, kicked, fought like a man drowning. Desperation in every move. He clawed toward the hallway, toward escape. But Alex grabbed the back of his coat, twisted, slammed him down again. "Stay down," Alex roared. Derek spat blood and snarled. "You think this ends with me? You have no idea what I'm tied into." "I don't care," Alex snapped. "It ends with you not touching him again." Alex's fist met Derek's jaw once. Hard. Enough. Derek's eyes rolled back. He went still. Alex collapsed to his knees, breath-heaving, hands shaking. Then he remembered. Eli. Gale. He ran. Back in room 3A, the chaos had settled to something far more haunting: stillness. Eli sat frozen at the edge of the bed, trembling. Gale's blood spotted his pajama sleeves. His eyes stared blankly ahead, fixed on the shepherd lying just beside him. Gale wasn't moving, just breathing shallow, too shallow. Alex skidded into the room, heart lodged in his throat. He dropped to Gale's side. Blood soaked the fur on the dog's left flank, pooling onto the hospital tile. "Stay with me, boy," Alex murmured. "You hear me? You hold on." Eli didn't blink, didn't speak, but his eyes were no longer blank. They were filling, brimming. "Medic," Alex shouted. "We need a vet team now. Trauma kit. Bleeding out." Then, a sound. Tiny, fragile. "Don't go." Alex froze. The nurses froze in the hallway. Eli's mouth opened again, trembling, cracking but full of something powerful now. "Don't leave me, Gale." The boy screamed it. Voice raw, loud, real. Everyone stopped. Tears burst from Eli's eyes. He dove off the bed and crawled to Gale, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, pressing his face into the blood-matted fur. "I need you. Don't leave me. Not like Mommy. Not like Daddy. Please. Please." His voice cracked into sobs. The room held its breath. And then Gale opened his eyes, just slightly, and barely so barely licked Eli's cheek. That tiny movement shattered something. Alex slumped in relief. Nurses rushed in with a trauma kit. Alex worked fast, steadying Gale's breathing, applying pressure to the wound, issuing commands he barely remembered learning years ago. But Eli never let go. Not once. And as the minutes passed, a miracle took root. Gale lived. Because of Alex. Because of Eli. Because of love. An hour later, Gale lay sedated in the animal care unit down the hall. A vet called in from home stitched the wound with practiced hands. "Clean slice," she'd said. "He'll make it." Barely. Alex leaned against the wall outside, clothes still soaked with rain. Bruised knuckles throbbing. Inside the children's ward, Eli sat quietly again, but this time not empty. His eyes had changed, not because of pain, but because of voice. He had spoken, he had screamed, and now he had been heard. The sterile hallway outside the animal trauma bay was dim. The overhead lights softened to midnight mode. The rain had stopped finally, but the walls of the mountain hospital still carried the echoes of the storm. The place felt like it was holding its breath. Alex Carter stood just beyond the glass partition, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the operating table where Gale lay, sedated but alive. Barely. A surgical team worked in practiced silence, scrubbing blood, stitching muscle, flushing the wound. The gash had come too close to a vital artery. A quarter-inch more and Gale wouldn't be breathing. But now, as machines hummed and the monitors beeped steady, there was a sliver of hope. Inside the trauma bay, Eli sat in a small plastic chair, hugging his knees to his chest. He hadn't spoken since his desperate cry, but he hadn't moved either. His tiny hands were still stained with dried blood. Gale's blood. His pajama shirt clung to his back, soaked with tears and sweat. Yet his eyes never left the dog. Alex leaned his forehead against the glass. He didn't know how long they stood like that, boy and dog on one side, man on the other. But something in the silence began to change. It wasn't the cold silence of shock anymore. It was the quiet that came after the break. A nurse approached quietly and tapped Alex on the shoulder. "We've just received word. Derek Morgan is in custody. He won't be getting near the boy again." Alex nodded, but he didn't take his eyes off Eli. Half an hour later, the surgery was over. Gale had been moved to recovery, an IV drip hanging beside his kennel. His breathing was shallow but regular. A warm blanket covered his body. His ears twitched now and then. Eli was allowed to stay with him under supervision. He sat cross-legged on the floor, one hand inside the kennel fingers, resting lightly on Gale's paw. "No words, just touch." Alex stepped into the room quietly and sat beside the boy. For a moment he said nothing, then softly, "When I was 10 years old, my mom died in a car crash. It was a snowstorm, just like the one last night." Eli turned his head slowly, listening. Alex continued, his voice rough. "I was with her, in the passenger seat. We skidded off the road and hit a tree. She was bleeding. I couldn't get out. My legs were pinned. I thought she was going to die right there with me. But then something started barking." Eli's brows furrowed slightly. Alex smiled faintly. "It was a dog, a search and rescue dog. He kept barking until someone found us. My mom was carried out first. I blacked out after that." He looked at Gale, then at Eli. "I never saw that dog again. But I always wondered who trained him, where he came from, why he was there that night." Eli blinked slowly, his gaze flicking to Gale's face. Alex took a breath. "Years later, when I became a firefighter, I saw a photo in a rescue training book. A German shepherd. Same eyes, same face. The caption said he'd been at the Rockies outpost for 10 years. His name was Gale." Eli's mouth parted just slightly. Alex looked him gently in the eyes. "That dog saved my mother. And now he saved you." Silence. Then Eli's lip trembled. His throat moved, trying to form a shape, a word. And then finally, he asked, voice soft and fragile, Did my mom ever say, 'Thank you'?" Alex froze. The way Eli said my mom like she was a ghost. He swallowed hard. "She did," Alex whispered. "They said the last thing she did before she lost consciousness was whisper it." "To Gale." Alex nodded. "To Gale." Eli turned to the kennel again. His little hand curled slightly around Gale's paw. The dog's ear flicked. "I think," Eli said, he remembers. Alex smiled. "I think so too." Then Eli said almost inaudibly, "She never got to tell me anything. Just stories my dad made up, but I always felt like she was still somewhere." Alex didn't answer. He just watched the boy, so small, so broken, yet suddenly glowing with something faint but real. "Connection." Eli exhaled, slow and shaky. "She must have loved Gale. He came back." Alex nodded. "He never forgot her. That's why he came back for you." Eli's voice cracked. "And now he's hurt. But he'll get better," Alex said firmly. "Because you called him back. You gave him a reason to fight." Eli's hand trembled on Gale's paw. Then he whispered, "Then I'll stay here. Until he knows I'm not going anywhere either." Alex placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. And for the first time, Eli didn't flinch. He leaned into it and cried, softly, silently, not like before, screaming in panic, but the way a child cries when they realize they are safe enough to cry. Morning light broke slowly over the peaks. The air was crisp, wet, filled with petrichor. Inside the room, Eli had fallen asleep, curled against the kennel. Alex covered him with a blanket, then sat beside him, and watched as Gale, still groggy, slowly opened his eyes again and saw both of them there. The shepherd's tail thumped twice against the inside of the kennel, and in that fragile second, something deep and eternal passed between all three souls in that room. A vow, unspoken, unbreakable. This wasn't over, but now they wouldn't be facing it alone. The first light of morning filtered through the windows of the small community volunteer center, casting soft streaks of gold across the weathered hardwood floor. The storm was gone now. Outside, patches of snow still clung to tree branches and rooftops, but the worst had passed. Inside, warmth had returned. The room was quiet, save for the occasional groan of an old radiator and the rhythmic tick of a wall clock. A pot of coffee brewed slowly in the background, its scent weaving through the air like a promise of calm. Alex Carter stood silently in the middle of the room, his arms crossed, gaze fixed on the sofa across from him. Eli was asleep, curled up against the armrest, his head resting gently on the thick fur of Gale, who lay beside him like a sentinel. The shepherd's body was bandaged, but relaxed, breathing steady. One paw draped protectively over Eli's feet. It was the kind of image that made everything else blur, the noise, the pain, the violence. Just them, as if this had always been the shape of their world. Alex exhaled slowly, then turned away, pacing quietly toward the far window. Snow melted in rivulets outside, trickling from the eaves. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from the county social worker. "We'll need to transfer Eli to the State Children's Center in 2 days. Let us know if anything changes." Alex stared at the words. His thumb hovered over the screen, uncertain. 2 days. That was it. He looked back at the sofa. Eli stirred slightly in his sleep, unconsciously gripping Gail's collar tighter. The boy hadn't said a word about the future, not since the hospital. But he hadn't asked to go anywhere either. He'd just stayed close to Gail and to Alex. 2 nights ago, after Gail's surgery, when the vet had said it'd be touch and go, Alex had found Eli wide awake at 3 a.m., sitting cross-legged by the kennel. When Alex asked what he was doing, the boy had simply whispered, "Waiting in case he forgets I'm here." Alex had sat with him the rest of the night. No words, just presence. And yet now, as routine returned, the system was preparing to move in, to sweep Eli into its files and policies. Another number in a list. Alex rubbed his forehead. He hadn't signed up for this. He was a firefighter, a volunteer. A man who lived alone, didn't even own a plant, let alone a child. He didn't know the first thing about parenting. He had no backup, no plan. But neither had Gail. And Gail had still shown up, still risked everything, still stayed. Alex walked back toward the sofa. He knelt down gently, watching the two of them sleep, boy and dog bonded in ways Alex could barely comprehend. A deep ache formed in his chest. He remembered what it was like to be left behind. After his mom's death, how relatives passed him around, how every goodbye bruised a little deeper than the last. No one meant to hurt him, but no one had stayed either. He placed a hand lightly on Eli's shoulder. The boy shifted, eyes fluttered, then opened. He looked up at Alex, still half asleep but alert. Alex smiled softly. "Hey, kiddo, you hungry?" Eli didn't answer, but after a moment he nodded. Gail stirred as well, lifting his head slightly. His eyes met Alex's. Something old and tired and loyal passed between them. "I'll heat something up," Alex said. "But first, can we talk for a sec?" Eli sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Alex sat beside him, close, but not too close. "I got a message," he began carefully. "From the people who handle where kids go when they don't have family around." Eli froze. He looked down, stiffened. "I'm not going," he said flatly. Alex blinked. "That's not how it works," he said gently. "They want to take care of you, help you find a place." "This is my place," Eli interrupted, voice shaking. He looked at Gail, then at Alex. "You said he came back for me. You said he stayed. That means this is where I'm supposed to be." Alex swallowed hard. Eli's lip trembled. "Don't make me go where no one stays." The words hit like a punch to the ribs. Alex had no reply, not one that wouldn't sound hollow. He stood up abruptly, paced the room, rubbed the back of his neck. The kid had been through enough already. And the thought of adding more abandonment. "I don't know how to do this," Alex admitted. Eli looked up. "I don't know what I'm doing. I barely keep myself together some days. I forget appointments. I burn toast. I don't even know what 5-year-olds eat." "I like grilled cheese," Eli said quietly. Alex blinked, then laughed. It was short, surprised real. "Okay, grilled cheese. Got it." A pause. Then Alex sat back down. "What I'm trying to say is, I don't want to make you promises I can't keep. I don't want to be another person who disappears." "You won't," Eli said simply. "How do you know that?" "Because you didn't." Alex stared at him. "You came when no one else did. And you stayed. Gail stayed too. That means we're a pack." The simplicity of it undid him. Tears stung at the corners of Alex's eyes. He leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor. A long silence passed. Then softly he said, "Okay." Eli looked at him. "Okay." Alex turned to face him fully. "I don't have all the answers, but I know what it feels like to not have a place. And if I can give you one, even if it's just trying, I want to." Eli didn't say anything. He just launched himself forward, arms wrapping tight around Alex's middle. Alex caught him, held him, and something inside both of them finally let go. Gail gave a soft bark, then laid his head back down, satisfied. The pack was together. No one was leaving. Not tonight. Not again. Snowfall had become a memory now melted into muddy soil, washed away by spring rains and the rising of something new in the valley. In the heart of a small, windswept town, clinging to the edges of the Rockies, construction dust hung in the air like pollen. The scent of sawdust and fresh paint filled every room of the old community center, now stripped to its bones and reborn with purpose. Alex Carter stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, running his palm along the smooth frame of the main entryway, his entryway now. This was no longer just a volunteer hub. This was the warmth of Gail. A name born not from sentiment, but survival. From loyalty carved into flesh, from a winter night that tried to take everything, and a dog who gave it back. The idea had come to Alex one morning weeks after Eli had finally started laughing again. He'd been sipping coffee in the half-lit kitchen while Eli and Gail curled up on the couch watching a documentary about animals who rescued humans. Eli's face had been quiet, but bright, like something inside him had finally found permission to hope. And Alex had whispered aloud to no one in particular, what if there were a place just for this? A pause, a heartbeat. Then he'd looked down at Gale sleeping peacefully beside the boy he chose to save and felt the weight of a purpose settle into his chest like gravity. It hadn't been a declaration. It had been a realization. Some people waited their whole lives to figure out why they survived when they shouldn't have. But Alex had already met the reason. Two, actually. Eli and Gale. The process was anything but easy. Permits, renovations, legalities, funding. No one knew what to make of the idea at first. A shelter for both abandoned kids and forgotten dogs. A shared space where trauma met trauma and healed together. It sounded like a sanctuary out of a storybook. But Alex had the one thing none of the officials could argue with, a story that had already happened. He didn't pitch them with diagrams. He showed them the security footage the night of the hospital storm. Gale blocking the doorway, Eli curled against him. He gave them the photo, Eli asleep in the recovery room, Gale's paw resting over his heart. He played them the 911 audio recording, where a voice his own cracked while saying, "We found him, a child, with a dog, alive." And after that, they didn't ask why anymore. They asked when. Alex worked through the nights. Hammered drywall by hand. Sanded old wood until it shone. Repainted the chipped corners and ripped out the rusted vents. He didn't hire a big team, just a few trusted folks from the rescue squad. A retired vet tech. A social worker named Dana, who cried the first time she met Eli and Gale. "I've never seen a bond like that," she said. "You're building a miracle, Alex, one brick at a time." They kept the rooms small but warm. No sterile white walls. Soft greens and earth tones instead. Windows in every sleeping area. Shelves low enough for children to reach, and dog bowls placed beside each bed. No one would ever feel like a guest here. They would belong. Together. Eli helped where he could. He named every empty room after colors he thought Gale would like. Honey room, river, room, tree room. Sometimes he'd pause in the middle of painting and ask Alex things like, "Do you think dogs dream?" Or, "What if the kids don't like Gale?" And Alex would always answer with the same truth. Gale doesn't need them to like him. He just needs them to feel safe. Eli always nodded at that, as if he understood safety in a way most people never would. One night, after a long day of laying carpet and building bunk beds, Eli sat cross-legged on the main floor with a crayon and a sheet of butcher paper. "What are you drawing?" Alex asked. Eli didn't look up. "A map. A map to where?" "To here," Eli said. "In case someone gets lost and needs to find the place where dogs don't leave." Alex swallowed hard and let the boy keep drawing. The center opened quietly. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no media circus. Just a sign handcrafted from salvaged pine wood, placed gently above the front gate. "The warmth of Gale, for those who were left but chose to stay." The first to arrive was a girl named June, 7 years old, recently removed from a home with no electricity and too many cigarette burns. She came in holding a garbage bag full of clothes and didn't speak for 2 days. Then she met Gale, and everything changed. The dog walked up to her, slow sat down and waited. She sat too, and cried. Not loud, just enough. The next morning, June was brushing Gale's fur while Eli watched from the hallway smiling. More kids followed, some for a week, some for longer. And each one found a friend in a creature who didn't judge their silence, who didn't flinch at their fear. Gale had no words, but he never needed them. He was the words. One evening after the lights had dimmed and the children were tucked in, Alex stood outside the building, watching snow begin to fall again. Just a few flakes, nothing threatening, just enough to remind him. Gale walked out and sat beside him, older now, still limping slightly, but alive. "Do you know what you've done?" Alex asked, rubbing the dog's ears. Gale looked up. No wag, no bark, just presence. Alex chuckled. "Of course you do." Inside, a girl's laughter echoed down the hallway. Then a boy's footsteps, the sound of safety, of belonging. A sound that used to feel like fiction. Alex closed his eyes and listened. And in that moment, he didn't just hear the past. He heard the future, one born not of revenge or rescue missions, but of warmth, of a silent vow spoken in the howling wind and sealed with paw and breath. A vow that said, "I will not leave you." And now, they never had to leave each other again. The first rays of spring filtered through the trees like gold, spun from silence. The snow was gone, melted into the earth, absorbed into roots, whispering its farewell through blooming wildflowers and dripping pine branches. In the clearing, tucked gently among towering evergreens and hummingbird wind chimes, the center stood still and steady. It had been 3 months since the warmth of Gale opened its doors, and this morning, like every morning, Eli woke before the sun. He padded barefoot through the hallway, his hand trailing along the cool wooden wall, stopping by the main room, where a sleeping mass of fur stirred with recognition. Gale lifted his head slowly. His tail thumped once. Eli smiled. "Let's go." Together, boy and dog pushed through the back screen door, stepping onto the dew-kissed grass, now dotted with purple crocus and wild daffodils. The air smelled of rain and pine of possibility. Laughter rose behind them as more children poured out. June and Caleb Tara, with her mismatched boots, the twins still half asleep. They scattered like sparrows into the yard. Gale lumbered forward slower than he used to, but still strong, still watching. Eli crouched down beside him, whispering something that no one else could hear. And Gale wagged once, understanding anyway. Alex stood on the porch, coffee mug and hand hair still a mess from sleep. He watched them all, the swirl of movement, the sound of joy. He watched Eli. He'd never seen the boy so light, no longer flinching at sudden sounds, no longer checking doorways before entering, no longer whispering every fear into the collar of Gale's fur. Instead, he laughed with the others. He led. He healed. Alex stepped down the porch stairs toward the wooden sign planted firmly near the gravel path. The warmth of Gale, for those who were left but chose to stay. His fingers brushed the carved letters like a prayer. Sometimes he still couldn't believe it was real. He turned when he heard the van. The social worker stepped out first, Dana smiling wide beneath her denim cap. Then the child followed. Small, thin, barely 7. She clutched a paper bag against her chest like armor. Her eyes were wide, scanning everything, ready to run if she had to. Alex knelt to meet her, level voice calm. Hi there. My name's Alex. This is a safe place, okay? She didn't answer, but she didn't back away either. Eli, still mid-chase, with June, spotted the newcomer. He froze for a second, then jogged toward her. No hesitation. He stopped a few feet away, then reached out his hand. You don't have to be scared, he said. Gale doesn't let anyone feel alone here. The girl's eyes shifted to the dog, now approaching slow, gentle, patient. Gale stopped beside Eli and sat. Quiet, still, safe. The girl trembled, then stepped forward. Eli offered his hand again. This time she took it. Come on, he said softly. We're just playing. You can meet everyone. And Gale, he never leaves anyone behind. The sun climbed. The yard filled with the music of children, feet stomping through muddy grass, voices, shrieking laughter ringing. Inside, Dana updated files, and Alex fixed a broken drawer in the kitchen. Gale wandered through the hall, pausing in doorways, accepting a pat, here a snuggle there. He moved like a memory, always present, always grounding. That afternoon, Alex brought out an old photo album. He sat with Eli and the new girl, her name was Rosie, and turned the pages slowly. Each photo was labeled in childlike handwriting. This one's when we built the bunk beds, Eli said, pointing. And that's when Gale barked at the washing machine for 2 hours. Rosie giggled for the first time. Alex added a new picture to the album that night, Rosie holding Gale's leash, her smile still cautious but real. Another name in the family, another warmth that stayed. That evening, Eli stood at the front steps, staring at the sky. Do you think Gale gets tired of saving people, he asked. Alex stepped beside him. I think Gale doesn't see it that way. What does he see? Alex thought for a long moment. I think he just wants to be near the ones who need someone. And he doesn't leave. That's his whole job. Eli nodded. But what if someday I'm the one who has to stay and someone else needs me? Alex crouched beside him. Then you'll know exactly what to do. Eli looked down at Gale, now lying near the flower beds, his eyes half closed, listening. I want to be like him. You already are. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. And Alex placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Dusk fell slow. Soft orange bled into lilac across the sky. The children gathered for dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup. Their laughter echoed down the halls like music. Alex sat with Rosie, helping her stir the soup. Across the table, Eli fed Gale bits of crust under the table, whispering secrets the dog had long learned to keep. When it was time for bed, the kids trickled off in pairs, Gale checking each room before finally curling up in his usual spot by the front door. Alex stood alone in the hallway, the silence thick with meaning. He stepped outside one last time that night, letting the breeze carry away the hum of exhaustion. And from that quiet came a thought. What if this was the whole point of everything? Not the rescue, not the fight, but this, the staying, the warmth, the choosing to return. The next morning, the center hummed to life again. And as the camera pulled back, rising through the pine trees, lifting past the rooftops, catching the shimmer of morning light across the clearing, it captured something most people spend lifetimes chasing. A child once abandoned, now chasing laughter. A dog once forgotten, now revered. A home born not of blood, but bond. And over it all, the gentle glow of something sacred. A voice soft, grounded, whispered over the image. Not everyone born to us is family. Family is who stays when we're most afraid, when we need them the most. Family is like Gale. Fade to black, fade to warmth. The story never ends. It only stays.